Good evening, and welcome to a panel discussion entitled, Why Get Married? This evening is a part of an ongoing series at Boston College that is called The Church in the 21st Century. Our intent is to address various issues that surround and arise from the current crisis in the Roman Catholic Church, at least in Boston, and as we understand now in the rest of the country and perhaps the rest of the world. One of the issues, of course, that is paramount or arises out of the current crisis of clerical celibacy, clerical sexual abuse, is the whole issues of sexuality. So this panel discussion this evening is the second in a series on sexuality. A few weeks ago, we had a panel discussion on sex. This evening, we are asking ourselves the question, why get married? There will be two more sessions in this series, one on celibacy and another one on homosexuality. I'm Pat DeLue. I'm Associate Academic Vice President, and I'm on the steering committee of the Church in the 21st Century Initiative. I should tell you that a little anecdote about how I happened to become the moderator of this series. At a steering committee meeting of the Church in the 21st Century Initiative, Father Joe Appleyard, who is our Vice President for Mission and Ministry and another member of the steering committee, after the meeting was over, leaned across the table to me and said, "Pat, I'd like to talk to you about marriage." I said, "Oh, please." No, that's not the way it's supposed to happen, Joe. No. Then he went on to ask me to moderate this evening, and I said, since I have some experience with marriage, I'd be happy to do that. What do we know about marriage? Let me listen to this for a moment. Marriage, says St. Paul, it's better to marry than to burn. Montaigne says, marriage may be compared to a cage. The birds outside despair to get in, and those within despair to get out. Marriage is a covenant which hath nothing free but the entrance. Hanging and marriage, says George Farquhar, go by destiny. William Congreve, every man plays the fool once in his life, but to marry is playing the fool all one's life. Shelley, a system could not well have been devised more studiously hostile to human happiness than marriage. Our three speakers this evening will give the lie to this maligning of this institution and the Roman Catholic sacrament of marriage. We're very pleased to have Professors Peter Kreeft of the Boston College Philosophy Department, Professors David McCarthy, and Professor Julie Rubio, who, if you count heads here and look for the woman among the crowd, you'll note Julie isn't with us yet. She's coming. She's on her way from the airport, and we'll put her third, hoping that she will arrive in time to speak. We'll ask Professor Peter Kreeft to speak first. Peter Kreeft is a longtime member of the Boston College Philosophy Department, a much published author and beloved teacher. Recent books that Peter has written are Angels and Demons, The Angel and the Ant, C.S. Lewis for the Third Millennium, The Shadowlands of C.S. Lewis, and Your Questions, God's Answers. Peter will speak to us this evening on marriage, the big picture. Peter.
Thanks. Is this working? Yes, good. Joe Appleyard suggested that all of us address the question of the significance of marriage and put the question, why get married, in that larger context. So I'd like to start by giving you the big picture. I don't remember much about my college education, and I don't remember much about any lecture that I ever heard in my life, except a few big pictures, a few big ideas which stay with me through my life. So if I can just leave one big picture in your mind, that'll be great. I take significance to mean not so much importance as meaning or design. Marriage is deliberately designed, unless you're an atheist, by a better plotter than Shakespeare. And therefore, marriage has some inherent natural meaning. We may add to it, we may interpret it, we may change it somewhat, but our artifices are just clothing on the body of marriage. Marriage is not fundamentally man-made. It's like natural rights. They're inalienable, although the state guarantees them by certain changeable positive laws. So what is the inherent or natural meaning of marriage? Well, I see at least 7. 4 natural and 3 supernatural. First, it is an expression of love. Secondly, it is geared to procreation and children. Third, it is the fundamental building block of society. The family, rather than the individual, is held by many societies, especially traditional societies like Confucian China, to be the fundamental unit, even the fundamental citizen. I can just imagine a Confucianist coming to America and saying, what, you have a 50% divorce rate? That means half of your citizens commit suicide. Fourth, marriage is the humanizing of the animal, the transforming of the animal, the kind of thing Teilhard de Chardin speaks of when he talks about the humanization of the world and the divinization of man, the kind of thing Hegel speaks of when he speaks of Aufhebung, or taking up into a higher unity. But the ultimate meaning of marriage, according to the Catholic Church, according to most Christians, Protestant as well as Catholics, has something to do with God, the ultimate reality. And I see 3 ultimate or supernatural meanings to marriage. First of all, marriage is the place where the greatest miracle in the world happens, with the possible exception of the Eucharist. Marriage and the Eucharist are the 2 holy doors by which God himself personally comes into our world. In marriage, he creates new images of himself. When you ask the question, why not sex outside of marriage, therefore, that's like asking the question, why not celebrate the Eucharist at a ball game? It's fun. And the answer is, you don't understand what it is if you ask that question. A second supernatural meaning of marriage is that it is an image of the Trinity, an image of ultimate reality, which according to Christianity is not just one, but one in many. To say that God is love is implicitly to say that God is not simply one, because for there to be complete love, there must be otherness. Otherwise, it's just selfishness. There is the self, and there is the other, and there is the love between them. And that's, in most Christian theology, the fundamental meaning of the Trinity. God, in other words, is a society. And therefore, marriage, like God, has an inherent structure. 2 equals become one while remaining 2. And from their union comes a third equal. In God, it happens in eternity. In us, it happens in time. In God, it's a spiritual principle. In us, it's aided by biology. Finally, marriage is also an image of our ultimate destiny, the spiritual marriage to God that all the saints and mystics talk of. It's no accident that romantic love, sexual intercourse, and marriage are the favorite metaphor for the mystics, for the thing that they see and experience as the highest thing available to human beings by grace, a total exchange of selves. This is inherently connected with the previous point that marriage is an image of the Trinity. Let me read a couple of paragraphs from what I think is an inexhaustibly profound chapter, the one by C.S. Lewis on heaven, which concludes the problem of pain. Even within the Holy One himself, it is not sufficient that the Word should be God, it must also be with God. The Father eternally begets the Son, and the Holy Ghost proceeds. Deity introduces distinction within itself, so that the union of reciprocal love can transcend mere arithmetical unity or self-identity. For in love or self-giving, we touch a rhythm not only of all creation, but of all reality. For the eternal Word also gives himself in sacrifice, and not only on Calvary, for when he was crucified, he only did that in the wild weather of his outlying provinces, which he had done at home in glory and gladness. From before the foundation of the world, he surrenders begotten deity back to begetting deity in obedience. From the highest to the lowest, self exists to be abdicated, and by that abdication become the more truly self, to be thereupon yet the more abdicated, and so forever. This is not a heavenly law which we can escape by remaining earthly, nor an earthly law which we can escape by being heavenly. What is outside the system of self-giving love is not earth, nor nature, nor ordinary life, but solely and simply hell. The golden apple of selfhood, here he refers to a famous Greek myth, thrown among false gods became an apple of discord, because they scrambled for it. They did not know the first rule of the holy game, which is that every player must by all means touch the ball, then immediately pass it on. To be found clutching it in your hands is a fault. To cling to it forever is death. But when it flies to and fro among the players, too swift for eye to follow, and the great master himself leads the revelry, giving himself eternally to his creatures in the generation and back to himself in the sacrifice of the word, then the eternal dance makes heaven itself drowsy with happy harmony. All pains and pleasures we know on earth are but early initiations into the movements of that dance. Now, that's a very mysterious and high and palmy vision, but that is the Christian vision. The consequences of this big picture for specific issues, such as sex, celibacy, homosexuality, divorce, and living together, which used to be called fornication, can be drawn very, very briefly. First of all, the ultimate meaning of sex is for marriage. It's not the other way around. It's not that marriage is a sublimation of sex. So better to marry than to burn, though true, is a rather low view of marriage. Paul himself has a much higher view in Ephesians 5. Sex is not, first of all and most basically, an animal thing, and then, as if God said, gee, we better patch that up, added marriage to it. Rather, marriage was the first thought, and sex is simply the raw material for it. As an artist, matter is there for the sake of the form, for the sake of the work of art. You've got to explain marriage from above because God designed it. Second, celibacy is a great thing only because marriage is a great thing. It's just the opposite of a denigration of marriage. It's the gift of a very high and holy thing. Third, the reason homosexuality is a deformation of God's design, even though it may be expressed with genuine love, is that there's no other. There's no sexual other, and there's no procreation possible in it by its very nature. So homosexual love is a confused reaching out in love. The river may be there, the intention may be there, but it's in the wrong riverbed, the wrong bank. In classical Christian morality, intention is necessary, but it's not enough. Fourth, divorce is not just a bad thing or a tragedy. It doesn't exist. It's a superstition. Chesterton wrote an essay called Divorce and Other Superstitions. The reason Catholics say, no big deal, get a civil divorce if you want, it's just a piece of paper, is that it's not a true piece of paper. If marriage is designed by God and not the state, and God says it's for life, then it's for life. It's an elephant, you see. It's not something we design. It's its own self, and you have the choice of getting on the elephant, but you're just a flea. And if you get on the elephant, you're the elephant's flea, and you go where the elephant goes. When my wife and I first got married many, many reincarnations ago, there was a funny movie around called Divorce Italian Style. This was the 60s, and there was no divorce in Italy for any reason. So divorce Italian style is murder. The only way you can get rid of your spouse is to murder him. So the lead character hired some mafia to get rid of his wife, and they killed everybody else instead of the wife, and it was a very funny thing. But we said to ourselves, this is funny, but it's also very comforting, because since we're Catholics, divorce doesn't exist. So we made a pact. We said, we might murder each other, but we'll never divorce each other. Murder is much more reasonable than divorce. It made us very, very secure. Finally, what's wrong with living together outside of marriage? Well, according to St. Paul, quoting Genesis, the two become one flesh. What happens in sexual intercourse is not just fun. what happens is an ontological mystery. It's the elephant, you see. There's a startling line in 1 Corinthians, somewhere in the middle, where he's talking to Christians who are going to prostitutes because they're all around Corinth. And he says, don't you realize that when you have sex with a prostitute, you, if you're a Christian, you make Jesus Christ have sex with that prostitute. Startling idea. The mere act of sexual intercourse sets up an ontological relationship that is marriage without the covenantal aspect of it. So it's not just illegal, it's ontologically illegal, so to speak. It's the elephant again. All right, that in outline is the big picture. But it's not only a picture that we paint. It's not only a view of marriage that we take. It's not only a philosophy that we think and argue. It's not only a dream that we dream, however beautiful. It's not an ideal that we conceive. It's not a fantasy that we imagine. It's not a theory that we hypothesize. It's not the Christian tradition that we conserve. It's a fact. It's an objective truth. It's like an elephant because it's revealed by God. I don't want to sound like a fundamentalist, but don't you have to start there with the fundamentals? God said it, I believe it, that settles it? Well, I agree with two-thirds of that. God says it, I believe it, that doesn't settle it. I still have to understand it, appreciate it, develop it, live it. But if Jesus says this, if the Bible says this, if the church says this, and if you don't say this, how can you call yourself a Christian? If God did it, if God designed marriage, created it, and revealed its meaning to it, to us, and if furthermore it is he who acts in it, as he acted to invent it, if it is a sacrament which effects what it signifies, in some sense, therefore, the real presence of God, somewhat like the Eucharist. If it is that, well, then it is this high and holy thing, and that's the big picture. If it's not that, then the church lies, and the Bible lies, and Jesus lies, and why should you be a Christian? So I believe you must say it is true. It is absolutely true. That doesn't mean you can say it is absolutely clear. It is a mystery. We see it through a glass darkly. We see as much of its meaning as a flea sees of an elephant, but it's a very big elephant.
Thank you, Peter. Because I'm going to change the program here a little bit. Since we do have some time, Professor Rubio isn't with us. Why don't we entertain a few questions for Professor Kreeft first? I'll limit the time now because we'll have lots of time for questions for both of our speakers, and we hope all three of our speakers after all three of them have spoken. But let's have a few questions for Professor Kreeft here. There's someone with microphones. Am I right? No, maybe not. If you can...
Is this the microphone?
There's a microphone here, but I thought there were some people with portable microphones. I'm sorry to do this unexpectedly. Is this one portable? There we go. There was a question. Back, straight up this aisle. There you go. Oh, sorry. You're next.
Is it on? Yeah. I wanted you to fill out what you said about celibacy is a great thing because marriage is a great thing. I thought that was interesting, but you didn't go into detail.
Celibacy is the offering up of a gift to God for a higher purpose. If the gift is a cheap thing, then the offering is no big deal. If the thing is a precious thing, the offering is a very big deal. In the Mass, what we offer to God is what God has first given to us, what is such a big deal that is more precious than the entire universe, namely Jesus Christ himself.
Thank you. There's another question there.
I was wondering what you thought about marriage as an institution outside the Catholic Church, whether or not it can still fulfill basically the core of what you said, but outside the Catholic framework?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure of the answer to it. My instincts are to be very adamant within the church and very liberal outside the church. So my instincts would be to say, let's not expect society to see the Catholic view, and in a pluralistic society, let's have two radically different kinds of marriage, Catholic marriage and non-Catholic marriage. Because here's the in-house rules and here's the out-of-the-house rules, and the out-of-the-house rules are, well, very, very different and negotiable, and the in-house rules are not. So I think that not expecting too much of a Catholic view of marriage outside the church would help to make very clear and sharp the Catholic view inside the church. Now, that's one side of the picture. The other side of the picture is the Catholic view, if it's true, is the fulfillment of human nature and human happiness, and the closer anybody gets to it, the happier they'll be. So take the question of divorce. Is divorce to be allowed? Well, the more divorce there is, the more pain there is, and the more misery and suffering and social disintegration. So it should be discouraged. But should it be allowed? Well, I think yes, because if you don't have this view, if you don't believe that marriage is designed by God and has to be for life, then not only would you feel resentful that you have to live by somebody else's view, and not only would that be politically impossible in a pluralistic society, but that would be counterproductive. But on the other hand, it should be actively discouraged because it does a lot of harm. I'd say the same thing about homosexuality. I would not want to forbid it by law. I would not want to create imposition. But if it is against God's design, then it's harmful and it's going to hurt people, and we want to help people. But we don't want to help them by harming them more than we're helping them. So we don't want to coerce in matters of religion.
Grace, do you have there's a question down here. Hi, thank you.
It's very popular today to believe that since Christ never said in the Gospels himself that fornication is not a sin, that as long as two people love each other and they're not hurting each other, that sex out of marriage is in some ways the imitation of Christ because they're loving each other fully, and that marriage isn't something that has to be a constraint around that. Could you just go back into that and develop that a little more fully?
Sure. The simplest answer to that is that Jesus says that lust is a form of adultery in the Sermon on the Mount. Well, lust is not as bad as fornication. So there's an a fortiori argument there. If he's against even lust, he would certainly be against fornication. Secondly, he was a Jew. Jews don't believe that fornication is okay. They have different laws about engagement and marriage, that sex is okay after you're solemnly engaged, but they don't believe fornication is all right. Jesus actually agreed with the Pharisees in their theology. He did not criticize their beliefs. They were the tough ones. They, for instance, did not allow divorce. They believed in the supernatural. The Sadducees were the liberals. Well, they weren't hypocrites like the Pharisees, maybe, but Jesus was, in that sense, a Pharisee. So he certainly would not have approved of fornication. Finally, I'd use the Pope's argument about body language, that sex outside of marriage is a kind of lie, because it says, I give you my whole self, but you don't really. You just give the other person your body. You don't give the other person your whole life, your commitment.
One more? Back there. Oh, you go ahead, Chris. That's fine.
You made no mention of natural law and the complementarity of the sexes. Could you elaborate on that?
I believe in both. And I think the natural law is pretty obvious there that the sexes are meant to be complementary. The two deviations from the view of sexual complementarity would be unisexism, that the difference between the sexes is a mistake or an accident or a superstition on the one hand, and at the opposite extreme, chauvinism, usually male chauvinism, but it could equally be female chauvinism, that one is superior to the other. Both mistakes are based on the same fallacy, namely that all differences are differences in value. But it seems pretty obvious to most sane people throughout history, simply by natural law, that vive la différence. And most men would be very glad to admit that they are vastly inferior to women at being women, and women would be very glad to admit that they're vastly inferior to men at being men. Oh, go ahead.
There's a little development in respect to tying natural law in with complementarity. You've got natural law in respect to contraception, which the church used in its encyclical on Humanae Vitae.
That's trickier. That is also natural law, but that's a secondary or even tertiary precept of the natural law. So that requires more seeing, more understanding, more steps. So the church itself does not expect everybody to see the wrongness of contraception as easily as they expect it to see the wrongness of, let's say, homosexuality or abortion. And by homosexuality, of course, I mean homosexual intercourse. Homosexual orientation, of course, is not a choice.
But you've also got the possibility of deducing the complementarity from natural law, meaning the two distinct natures by nature who are related in a certain way. Which way, just in terms of common sense, although many would disagree with it, they're related such that they complement each other, they fill each other. Virtue of their psychology and their body, each of which are oriented towards each other. So you can derive complementarity from the natural.
I completely agree. And one reason is that I agree is that that's the traditional view. Most people see it. That doesn't prove it's right, of course, but it's an evidence that it is a matter of natural law and not divine revelation, that most people see it.
Thank you. Let's hold the other questions that you have for Professor Kreeft until after our second and third speakers. I'd like to introduce our second speaker this evening. Professor David Matsko-McCarthy is currently Assistant Professor of Theology at Mount St. Mary's College in Maryland. He has also taught at the College of St. Rose in Albany, New York. David did his doctorate at Duke University and has written extensively on sex and love and marriage. Has recently written a book called Sex and Love in the Home, A Theology of the Household. And for a commercial moment, this book, I think, is available outside our theater here this evening. So if you'd like to purchase a book, after you've heard David and decide you want to purchase one of his books, you can get a signed copy outside in the corridor. David will speak to us this evening on a glass slipper or an old shoe. David?
The title for my talk came from a student. I was having a conversation with the philosophy club. I'd been invited to talk about debating sexual morality. The wimp that I am really didn't want to do that. I thought it would be interesting to just talk about what is sex. So we had this kind of brainy discussion about what is sex. And as you can imagine, it kind of went various directions. And at one point, a student just shifted the conversation and started talking about Cosmopolitan magazine. And then she shifted it further and started talking about this unnamed male on campus who seemed to always be looking around and wasn't satisfied. So you can just imagine how those things work, how the conversations go. Well, after the conversation, after the formal conversation, she talked with me for a while after, just one-on-one. And she started out our conversation saying, "I'm so afraid to get married." And then she went on to explain how she had a very close family and went into a lot of detail about that. But her father was going through his second divorce. And when she asked him what had happened, his answer was, well, you know, marriage just gets to be like an old shoe. So there you go. There's the old shoe part of the title and what has sort of initiated the talk. I get married. There you go. The old shoe. Now, apparently being an old shoe isn't a good thing, but I hope to convince you by the end of my remarks in 10 minutes that maybe it is. Maybe it is. It seems to me that it matters what you've done in your shoes. I have this pair of shoes. When I got the old shoe image, I immediately thought of a pair of old shoes sitting in my closet that I wore and lived in for a couple weeks in the mountains of Bolivia. I ripped the toe of these shoes playing soccer, and mostly because I don't know how to play soccer, and I was just this big white guy taking up space, kicking things that came in my face. And there it is, the adventures I've had in those shoes. Now, it's not the kind of adventures you might imagine, it seems to me. If you think about going to South America and having adventure, you might think about staying at a poolside resort with flip-flops, yes? A resort, staying by the pool, drinking highballs, having a wonderful time. The kind of adventure you would not take old shoes along, right? So this is a different kind of adventure to imagine. You know, you have to imagine adventure of sleeping on the ground, tasting things that really taste bad, being happy that you have a plain potato. These sorts of things that are adventures, taking a while for your stomach to adjust what's going on. But then there's these moments, just wonderful, stunning moments of seeing the sun set below the clouds because you're 300 feet high in the Andes Mountains. So you have to imagine, it seems to me, a different kind of adventure, but an adventure nevertheless. So that's going to be my way to convince you about the old shoe. And it seems to me, then, to get on to that, you have to understand the adventure, that is, to propose that marriage is an adventure. What I really want to do is go from, well, I'll go in my order here. I want to talk about the adventure, but it seems to me not only do you have to talk about the adventure, you've got to talk about what you need to get through the adventure. For instance, with the shoe analogy, you need a versatile pair of shoes. You can do a lot of different sorts of things, and you get the picture. Okay. Now, since I was on the footwear, and I have to say, see, I didn't introduce the footwear analogy, but I got to see it the way through. So I had the old shoe, so I went with the glass slipper. And everybody knows the story of Cinderella, and I ask you for a moment to finally think of it from the man's angle. The prince. Think about the prince. Here he is, his daddy's holding the ball for him. Women are flocking there to see him, just to have him glimpse them, yes? And then by chance, he glimpses Cinderella, who enters the ball, as we know, by chance as well. And I can't remember the details, or maybe there are no details at all, but they talk. We have one version at home where they eat dinner, and she keeps passing the good food to her stepsisters. But anyway, they eat, they talk, the bell tolls, she runs out, she leaves her slipper, and it's a duke, I think, that gets sent out throughout the kingdom to check all the feet, because the prince, among all these women, will only take that one. Seems to me that's the glass slipper. That is romantic love. That you catch the eye of the one you love, one you learn to love, and that one becomes irreplaceable. And you become irreplaceable to that woman or that man. And there you are. It's a good reason to get married. Very good reason to get married. Now, it seems to me the problem with the glass slipper is it gets you there. It gets you there, but it can't keep you there. So it seems to me romantic love is just a wonderful way in, but it's not going to keep you there. And so here we go to the old shoe. Now, what I want to do really with the old shoe and getting to the old shoe is really pass through friendship along the way. So you can see my glass slipper, the old shoe. I have, well, glass slipper and romantic love. My old shoe really, I think, is affection. So I kind of want to end up with affection and pass through friendship in between. And friendship's a prominent theme in theologies of marriage. I don't think I'm really saying anything new or unusual here. I think it has to be distinguished from some modern forms of friendship. I think of an Aristotelian form of friendship, where friendship is based in the good of the friendship and in the good of the friends and in the good they share and the good they work toward together. I think this is much different from, and I'm taking this term, I don't know if it works for you, from a sociologist called Anthony Giddens, who talks about the pure relationship. And what he's saying, it says, distinguishes the pure relationship in romantic terms from what I've described as Aristotelian friendship, is that pure relationship is founded internally, it's founded on intimacy. And he says there's contradictions to this, because intimacy is supposed to found, the trust and the wholeness. The intimacy it leads people in romantic love to say absolutely crazy things like, I want to be with you in sickness and health, for rich or for poor, until death tears us apart. But it's not supposed to have any external constraints. It's not supposed to have anything external at all. It's supposed to be built absolutely internally, thus the pure relationship. It is the intimacy of the relationship itself which sustains all of these desires for love, or promises that are made. And it seems to me friendship in the Aristotelian form is founded on shared activities and a kind of shared vision and a shared good. And it seems to me what also is interesting about Aristotelian conceptions of friendship is that they are assumed to be in a kind of public context of common activities, and they're always open to more friendships. It's not a face-to-face as much as joining together with others in a kind of common work and moving toward a common goal. Now, it seems to me that's plainly true of family life. Plainly true? I don't know. But it seems to me a key difference from, say, the way you get on the way to marriage with the dinners and the gazing into each other's eyes. I remember my wife saying to me very stupid things, and me thinking, she must love me so much. She even will say stupid things to me. Because our relationship, it seems to me, was founded on gazing into each other's eyes. And it seems to me what has happened to us over our marriage is we look at each other at the end of the night and think, so when have we looked at each other last? And that we're involved in a kind of common work of family life and looking out for each other's good and the good of our family and all kinds of goods of common life. It seems to me that in Christianity you do this on a variety of levels, from raising the family to, it seems to me appropriate today, to say working for peace in the world, and these sorts of things which become an engaging part of family life. Now, just to conclude, I want to get back to the affection. Seems to me that romantic love is one thing, but affection may be far more profound. I mean the kind of affection that is fully recognizes one's faults, remembers one's failures, knows one's great strengths, has watched somebody throw up. It's a kind of affection of an old shoe, of being so deeply, unconditionally loved because you have shared an adventure. Like I say, not an adventure like sitting beside a pool with your flip-flops on. Sometimes more like sleeping on a dirt floor. But then having moments of looking out and seeing the sunset under the clouds in the empty sky. So there you go. I'm kind of giving you a story to tell about why get married. Sure, get married for romantic love, but stay married for friendship, and at the end of the day, hope for that great affection that will come your way.
I have great news. Professor Julie Hanlon-Rubio is here. Despite the airlines, despite O'Hare Airport, without luggage, she is here. Welcome, Julie. Rather than have questions for David, I think because time is short and we do want to have discussion, let's hold the discussion, the questions for David and discussion of his talk until after we hear from Professor Rubio.
Thank you. It's very good to finally be here. I was going to wear a dress, I promise, but it's in my luggage, so I apologize. So, why get married? When we look at this question from a contemporary perspective, we tend to think, why not live together? But because that's the question of our culture, and it's an important question. But the early Christians would have asked, why not stay celibate? And it's that question that I'd like to focus on tonight in order to shed some light on why both Christian marriage and celibacy are significant Christian choices. Many early Christian writers regarded celibacy as the sure path to holiness. They worried that spouses, especially wives, children, and sex would distract believers and make it harder for them to focus on higher goods. One of my favorites is St. Jerome, who memorably writes, he counseled men not to take wives. And he wrote, matrons want many things, costly dresses, gold jewels, great outlay, maidservants, all kinds of furniture, litters, and gilded coaches. Then come the lectures, the livelong night. She complains that one lady goes out better dressed than she, that another is looked up to by all. There may be in some neighboring city the wisest of teachers, but if we have a wife, we can neither leave her behind nor take the burden with us. To support a poor wife is hard. To put up with a rich one, a torture. It's important to point out that St. Jerome, like most of the early Christian writers, defended marriage against those who thought celibacy was the only path to holiness. But he clearly saw celibacy as the superior choice. Other early Christians advocated an interesting alternative to foregoing marriage altogether. The 3rd century writer of the apocryphal Acts of Thomas, for instance, uses the device of a play to convince his audience that spiritual marriage is the higher calling. In the play, Jesus addresses a young couple about to consummate their marriage, and he says, "Know that if you refrain from this filthy intercourse, you will become holy temples, pure, free of trials and difficulties known and unknown, and you will not be drowned in the cares of life and of children who lead only to ruin. If you produce many children, you'll become greedy and avaricious because of them, robbing orphans and defrauding widows. And by doing so, you will render yourself liable to the harshest punishments. For many children become a liability, being harassed by demons, some openly, others covertly. Some become lunatics, others are half withered or lame or deaf or mute or paralytic or idiots. Even if they're in good health, they'll be do-nothings, committing useless and disgusting deeds. But if you are persuaded to keep your souls pure for God, you will live an untroubled life, free of care and grief, while awaiting that true and incorruptible marriage with Christ." While both of these authors are extreme in some ways, their concerns were shared by many early Christians who sought what historian Peter Brown calls singleness of heart, and believed that marrying could be problematic because it divided the heart between family and God. This sentiment is hard for us to understand today. Why was it so inconceivable to these Christians that a married couple might be united in love for God, each other, and their children? For most, male-female friendship was nearly unthinkable because of women's assumed lack of capacity for reason. Mutual help was the best one could hope for. A mistrust of sexuality and a strong sense of the capacity of marriage to immerse spouses in the material world also contributed to the unwillingness of many to see marriage as sacramental. Indeed, it took many hundreds of years for the church to name marriage as a sacrament and to mandate a distinctive Catholic marriage liturgy. So were the early Christians misguided? While contemporary believers might see potential for male-female friendship in marriage and affirm even the goods of married sexuality, the scriptures don't provide much support for that sort of vision. In Jesus' own life, devotion to his mission seems to take priority over commitment to family. Prime example is a story in Mark's gospel in which Jesus is teaching a large crowd. His mother and brothers hear about this, and they go to find him and restrain him to bring him back. When told that his mother and brothers have come to see him, Jesus looks around at those who are sitting around him, and he says, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother, sister, and mother." Jesus not only rejects his family's attempts to take him away from his disciples, he uses his refusal to come with them as an opportunity to call kinship bonds into question. He says very plainly that those he has gathered around him are his new family, and he seems to deny all loyalty to his family of origin. Jesus effectively tells his disciples that spiritual kinship is more important than physical kinship. How are we understand this radical decentering of family? Jesus' preaching might provide some clues. In one typical passage, Jesus tells a man who wants to follow him that he may not stop and bury his dead father. Let the dead bury their own dead, but as for you, go and proclaim the kingdom of God. Here, Luke shows Jesus asking for devotion to the kingdom, understanding his command will force his followers to question even ordinary family commitments. This passage grates against our most basic moral sensibilities. What can Jesus possibly have meant by this? He cannot have been speaking literally. Yet even a more symbolic interpretation leaves us with a fairly extreme family-denying ethic. Perhaps, some have argued then, Jesus is speaking only to those who have a special calling to leave everything for him. However, it seems more likely that this saying of Jesus is not a literal command addressed only to a few. There's no indication that it is, but rather a broader command intended to address a general need for disciples of Christ to place their commitment to God above their family obligations. Some New Testament scholars argue that Jesus' radical anti-family message was rooted in his commitment to inspiring new forms of common life. The mission required some to leave families and spread the gospel, while others opened and restructured their families at home. The goal was a society in which people treated each other with compassion, forgave each other's debts, shared property, and refused to lord power over each other. A radical rejection of the traditional family was necessary in order to move toward the goal of a renewed family and community life in which discipleship was the main priority for everyone. One major part of that reconstruction was a dismantling of the patriarchal family. And surely it's true, as some scholars have argued, that Jesus was concerned about the power of fathers in the family. While it's tempting to believe that this concern about sexism is all there is to the anti-family strain in the message of Jesus. After all, this would mean that our own family-focused values were not so far off the mark. If sexism is the problem and we're no longer sexist, then maybe Jesus' message cannot properly be called anti-family at all. However, patriarchy in the family is not Jesus' only concern. As many of his sayings show, family itself is problematic. The strongest of the anti-family sayings, for example, this is my students' favorite, whoever comes to me and does not hate, they always ask, are you sure that translation is correct? But hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even life itself, cannot be my disciple. This seems to indicate that some kind of deprioritizing of family is essential to discipleship. If these demands are meant to apply to all who would follow Jesus, Christians must confront a Jesus who radically questions much of what we value most. We have to wonder what could have inspired such concerns. What was Jesus so worried about? It's important to put the sayings in context. The marriage ideals of both Jewish and Roman culture were sweeping in scope and demanding in expectation. It's not difficult to understand that Jesus of Nazareth, who sought to give himself totally to God, questioned the marital ethos of his times. The demand for so much loyalty to family seemed to him idolatrous. He did not want family to function as an idol in his life or in the lives of his followers. So he asked disciples to go against the cultural mores of his time and put God first. However, Jesus does not reject marriage altogether. Rather, in his refusal to sanction divorce, he reaffirms the importance of marital commitment in the lives of the people he has gathered around him. He recalls the myth of Genesis and claims that from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And this saying is widely viewed as support for marriage as a holy union. So if marriage is not rejected, what is? Certainly the patriarchal structure of the family, but it's difficult to deny a more far-reaching anti-kinship message in Jesus' sayings, for he doesn't simply target fathers. Mothers, children, and siblings are implicated as well. The bond of kinship and all the ethical priority that comes with it is being called into question. Because the Jesus of the gospel preaches that family, like money and power, can be dangerous to the person who is trying to live a holy life. He taught that those who would serve God must resist the temptation to make care of their only mission in life. The early Christians heard that message, and that's a part of why they said such shocking things about marriage. So what are contemporary disciples of Christ to do? First, I think we should celebrate the gift of celibacy. The lives of the many celibate men and women in our communities are faithful to the spirit of the New Testament. They testify that there is more to life than what this world has to offer. Their seeking after marriage with Christ reminds all of us of the primary importance of the spiritual life. Their single-hearted devotion to God inspires us to focus on the greatest prize of all. There are many stories of single-hearted celibates in our tradition. St. Augustine, who finally rested in God after a long struggle with sexual sin. Women mystics like Marjorie Kemp, who left her husband and many children to bear witness to her love for Christ and was gifted with nearly constant crying. You should read her book, she's always crying, for Christ's passion and suffering, as well as ecstatic visions of her marriage to Christ. And closer to our own time, Dorothy Day, who gave up her love to become a Catholic and lead the Catholic worker movement. Contrary to what some in our culture would think, celibacy can be a healthy, holy, and life-affirming choice. We should acknowledge that the early Christian tradition puts the burden of proof on believers who choose to marry. The question for those of us who will not embrace celibacy, and that will most likely be most of us, is this: how will you follow Christ amid all the other pressures of marriage and family life, in the midst of the mortgage, and the cooking, and the homework, and the diapers, and the college tuition, and everything else? Okay? However, our celebration of celibacy should not preclude a celebration of marriage. Because despite the early ambivalence, the Christian tradition eventually comes to see marriage as a holy calling, a sacrament even. Alongside the strain of the tradition that emphasizes the single-hearted calling of celibacy are the insistent voices of those who look back to the creation stories of Genesis 1 and 2 and point out that marriage is part of God's plan for human beings. Pope John Paul II in particular sees in these stories ample evidence that God created male and female to give themselves in love to each other. The vision of Genesis is the assumed norm of the Old Testament and is complemented by the metaphorical use of married love to describe God's relationship to the Hebrew people. God is faithful as a husband is faithful, even to an adulterous spouse. Jesus reaffirms marriage in the New Testament even as he displaces it in his quest for radical devotion to God. The Apostle Paul's letter to the Ephesians compares marriage between a man and a woman to a relationship between Christ and the church, saying that a husband loves his wife as Christ loves the church, sacrificing his very life for her. Contemporary theologians usually modify the metaphor by allowing that both spouses can be Christ for one another. This esteem for marriage is an important part of our tradition. It comes in large part from the experience of married people who testify that they have come to know God not apart from, but in and through their families. Today, marriage is celebrated as a sacrament of human friendship, a communion of love, intimate partnership. Most Christians believe that it is through our most intimate relationships that we taste something of the divine. This idea is so widespread that when my students in my marriage class encounter these anti-family sayings in the writings of the early church fathers, they are stunned. It's never occurred to them that family could stand in the way of a relationship with God or prevent someone from becoming a better Christian. However, it's important that our high esteem for marriage does not allow us to forget the early Christian suspicion of marriage. The witness of the New Testament and the early church is just too strong to ignore. We Christians can remember by advocating a distinctive way of being married. If Christian marriage is to avoid the problems that so worried Jesus and the early church fathers, it must allow for a sort of devotion, the kind of devotion that Christian discipleship requires. Pope John Paul II's theology of the family offers a good model. In contrast to those Christians who advocate a more single-minded focus on the family, the Pope claims that families have 4 distinct tasks: becoming a communion of love, serving life, serving society, and being the church in their home. The total self-giving to the spouses to each other and to the children is the foundation of family life, but not its only end. The love spills over as the married couple accepts new life as a gift, tries to live simply, and welcomes those whose lives others deem worthless. The family's embrace of marginalized persons flows out of their love for each other and constitutes what the Pope calls a spiritual fecundity or fruitfulness. However, the Pope notes that loving each other, having babies, and keeping a welcoming home are not enough. Rather, families must work to transform the world around them so that respect for the dignity of persons increases. This means committing to the work of charity and of justice. Finally, families are not simply part of the church, they are the church in miniature. Like the larger church, they grow together in faith, bear witness to their faith, and serve in the world. The Pope's theology assumes that families must be committed to more than their own good. The genius of Catholic teaching on the family, in my view, is its refusal to limit families by telling them to simply focus on themselves. Christian families, from this perspective, are to grow in self-giving love within and outside the bonds of kinship. This constitutes a distinctive way of being family in a materialistic, inwardly focused society. In St. Louis, I am privileged to know many families who try to live out this vision. Many give up the comfort and isolation of the suburbs for the joys and challenges of difficult neighborhoods in the inner city. Many support Karen House, the Catholic worker house in town, by taking house overnight, tutoring students, cooking meals, even preparing Christmas breakfast. Some are connected by the Parenting for Peace and Justice network started by Jim and Kathleen McGinnis, who are St. Louisans, and they form support groups for parents who are committed to combining child rearing with serious commitments to peace and nonviolence and justice. Many of these families in this past year have attended anti-war protests together. I've never lived in a place where I have felt so challenged and inspired by the witness of people who've refused to let family stand in the way of Christian commitment. Marriage for these families is instead a vital source of communion and solidarity. In a church in turmoil over sexuality, celibacy, and children, it's important to think about the significance of marriage. I've tried to argue tonight that in the Christian tradition, marriage must be a vocation to love, life, justice, and community, if it is to be justified at all. The distractions of marriage are powerful. However, like celibates, married persons will be able to live out the radical calling of Christian faith if they understand that marriage involves the commitment, suffering, and joy through which they may come to see the face of God. While kissing a spouse, listening to a child, working in a local shelter, or gathering a group of family and friends around a table to pray may be murkier windows to the divine than the clear, ecstatic visions of celibate mystics. Married Christians know that God is present even there.
I should have pointed out before Professor Rubio started that among her extensive writings on Christian family ethics, including writings on birth control, homeschooling, and parenting, she's written a recent book called A Christian Theology of Parenting, and we have it available outside the door. And if you ask, I'm sure Julie will find a copy for you. Well, remember I said at the outset that Shelley, among many of the people who maligned marriage, said that marriage is a system that could not well have been devised more studiously hostile to human happiness. Well, as promised, our three speakers, I think, have given the lie to that notion. We agree clearly on the great and good affection that is an essential part of marriage. There were some differences, though, among our speakers, and I invite you all to ask them questions, perhaps to get them to speak among themselves about their differences and their agreements. Please, join the discussion. Have questions? There's a microphone that's on its way up to you.
I was hoping to hear you all say a little bit something about marriage between Christians and non-Christians.
It's been a while, but I read a book by Michael Lawler. Jeez, I wish I could remember the title. Does anybody know this title? Anyway, he's got an interesting twist on this that I hadn't thought of before I read the book, and that was that marriage between different faiths, I think he was talking about in that book, could be a way to for the church to work out its mission to understand other faiths. So he takes what could be a negative and turns it into a positive, which seems to me to be an interesting prospect. On the other hand, it seems to me that would be an incredibly hard burden for a single family to bear, to take seriously two faiths. It seems to me that in the shared life of family, that sharing a common hope and very concrete feel for God in your lives, the tangibles, seems to me almost indispensable. So, I mean, I gave you the positive, which, like I say, Michael Lawler, if you're interested in the book, I wish I could remember the title.
The idea that you can make a positive out of the negative is fascinating, but it presupposes that the negative is negative. So the primary data, which is pretty clear in the New Testament, is a very strong discouraging of marriage between a believer and an unbeliever. Paul says, do not be unequally yoked together. I take that to mean the same sort of thing as in 1 Corinthians 6, he discourages Christians from suing other Christians before pagan judges. The consciousness of the distinctiveness of being a Christian was so great in the early church that it was almost as if Paul would say, look, you're a dog. Why do you go before a cat to judge you? Not that dogs are necessarily superior to cats, but they're that different. They're another species. Men and women aren't other species, but Christians and non-Christians are other species. If any man is in Christ, he is a new creation. Now, one way of mitigating that enormous difference is just watering down religion as such. And that's obviously not the right way of doing it. But on the other hand, some creative mixture like you speak of could contribute more than anything else to solve the problem of interreligious dialogue and comparative religion. I know 3 families who, pretty well, who are families of intermarriage. One of them is a Roman Catholic and an Eastern Orthodox, and they've lived in a very happy marriage for 40, 50 years. They attend each other's churches, they learn from each other's traditions. It's an incredibly good thing, and there's been very, very little tension. Another one is a Protestant and a Catholic couple, 2 of them, in fact. One of them resulted in a conversion. The Protestant became a Catholic. The other resulted in a divorce over religious differences. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
I think I'd want to point out that at least since Vatican II, that the Church has been much more accepting of especially of interchurch marriages. At the same time, the Pope's strong theology of the family seems to presume some unity of belief. It makes the family so strongly a domestic church, a place where faith is lived and passed on. It seems difficult to realize that vision with people of 2 different faiths. But I think it can be done. I like to say that I have a mixed marriage. Even though my husband and I are both Catholic, we cancel each other out in the voting booth. And so we argue a lot over politics and sometimes feel ourselves coming to be different species, perhaps. But we hope that can be a source of strength in our family. That is, that we can teach our children that we can disagree and believe very different things, and yet still respect each other and love each other, and that we hope to give to our children the sense that we love you whatever you believe. So I think from that perspective, it might have a lot of potential, actually.
There's a question back there.
I have a question specifically, primarily for Professor Craif, but for the other panelists as well. Can you talk a little about the role of contraception, the contraceptive mentality, and that's effect on the Christian understanding of marriage?
Let me just do one aspect of it. In light of what the 3 of us all agree with in marriage, and there are some differences, I think, at least I think we agree with with this, that contraceptive love is incomplete love. It's love where something is held back. It's a little bit, therefore, like sex outside of marriage. It's deformed, it's incomplete. Whether for that reason it is always wrong is another question. I think the church has spoken pretty clearly on that question, but that's an issue that I think is less clear in most people's minds than the instinctive realization that the very concept of holding something back is not what full love wants to do. It's a little bit like a separation. Catholics can have separations but not divorces. Why should they have separations? Well, in emergency situations, if there's abuse, if there's drug addiction, if there's really an emergency, you don't want to do it. It's like amputating a limb. Well, I think instinctively, many people, even those who support the possibility of contraception, like those who support the possibility of divorce, see it as a tragic second best. I'd appeal to instinct first, and before the Lambeth Conference, that instinct was widespread. No Christian church had any doubt about the natural wrongness of contraception. Even Freud spoke disparagingly of it.
Oh, do that one, and you're next, okay? Please.
I was just going to say, how would you respond to someone who would say that sexual intercourse within the context of marriage can be an ultimate form of sharing Christ's love between two people, and that the requirement of lifelong celibacy among our clergy is a way of taking away that privilege of them to share Christ's love with other people, and at the same time is sort of taking away or robbing Christ of sharing that love between some of his most steadfast followers. And I was wondering what you would think about allowing at least a division of our ordained clergy to take vows that allow them to embrace both Christ's love in the priesthood and Christ's love through sexual intercourse through marriage.
Well, that's already done in the Eastern Orthodox Church. It's done for Anglicans who become Catholics who are already married. It was done in the first 10 centuries or so. Even when marriage was discouraged, it was allowed among the clergy. So that is not a doctrine of the church. That's a pastoral rule of practice which may be changed once again. And that may be one argument for it. And in response to your argument, though, I'd say that when you give up the gift of sex and marriage in order to be a celibate priest, you re-enter another dimension of sex and marriage. You marry the church.
I think your whole question is based on a misreading of Scripture. It never says that sex is sharing a love between husband and wife. It says the marriage is. And that's a huge difference. I think it's just a just destructive romanticization of sex to think that it's some moment where you reach this. In a way, certainly you can share love, God's love, Christ's love, in a sexual relationship. But to call the sexual act a essential sharing of Christ's love is just wrong. It puts the cart before the horse. Marriage is the wider context that gives sex meaning, rather than vice versa.
I think what's interesting about your question, though, is that you're coming to it from a contemporary perspective in which we do see the goodness of married sexuality and the relation of that sexuality to spirituality, which is something that the early church fathers probably would not have grasped. And so then, given that really positive view of sex, it's not something that you want to avoid at all costs because it's always at least a little sinful. Then, what is it that we're afraid of our clergy embracing? So I'm intrigued. I've not thought through my own position completely yet, but I'm intrigued by proposals that that would offer celibate life for those in religious life or monastic communities, and the opening of diocesan priesthood to women and or men who are married.
I want to throw one other log on the fire here. In the Jewish tradition, you don't have this exaltation of celibacy. Rabbis are expected to get married. And Jesus was a Jew, and we can't forget that. I think, contrary to your intention, I hope contrary to your intention, some of your earlier remarks sounded kind of Gnostic. Jesus calls kinship into question. Well, that assumes that he's a Jew, and he assumes that kinship is a great thing, and only for a greater thing would he dare call something into question. I'm sure his audience was just as shocked as your students are when he says you have to hate, that is, turn your back on your very parents.
Absolutely.
That doesn't denigrate parents, it just assumes that they're a high thing. Most of the early heresies were infected with Gnosticism in some way or other. That was the master heresy in the early church. And also, most of the early heresies forgot that Jesus was Jewish. They uprooted him from that background. So I think we have to start with our data and see the Jewishness. And therefore, I would not agree that Jesus really is calling kinship bonds into question.
I guess I would argue that in the Christian tradition, there's been a tendency to spiritualize those things about family as well as those about money. To say, well, he's really talking about an attitude rather than an actual way of life. But I think in more recent New Testament scholarship, there are lots of voices, and I'm not a New Testament scholar, obviously, so I can only read the scholars and try to evaluate, but there are lots of voices saying maybe there's something to this that we've missed because we haven't wanted to hear it, and so we've moved too easily to, well, he just meant love God first. That's pretty
I'm
easy.
assuming Augustine is anti-Gnostic.
Yeah.
Yes. He takes those passages to claim that they represent how the church reproduces itself in the spirit. And so you can certainly make the spiritual claim without denying the body. In fact, the body might become more important because the body, it's assumed, I think of the people who went out into the desert, they assumed that they were after spiritual poverty, but they assumed that you had to take on material poverty to get there. Mm-hmm. I take the claim to be the same. Hardly is it anti-Gnostic. Hardly is it Gnostic. In fact, celibacy might be profoundly anti-Gnostic in the sense that it takes the body so seriously.
There was a question down here. Do you still have your question? Yes. Good. There's a question here.
Professor Kreeft, you said celibacy is offering the gift that God gave you back to God. I understand that God can't really be offended because that's a human feeling, but could you at all see a similar thing with God? If you give marriage, this wonderful thing that God has given us, back to Him, is that offensive to God in any way? Is it you not accepting such a wonderful thing that God gave to you? Can you?
Oh, no. The spirit in which somebody who becomes a Catholic priest offers this up to God is the same spirit in which you might offer your bread and wine to a priest to be used in the Eucharist. It's not, I don't want this anymore, take it back. It's not, take back the ticket, like Camus' Rebel. It's just the opposite. This is a precious thing, but a Catholic believes that God speaks through the church and through the church's institutions and through priesthood and through its celibacy, and therefore it's God's invitation not only to accept this gift, but also to offer it back to Him for this other state.
Another question? Here, a close one for you.
Are children necessary for a marriage?
Good question.
Isn't that like saying, is the Holy Spirit necessary for the Trinity?
You don't get to decide.
Touche.
Well, for instance, is it okay for old people who cannot have children to marry?
Yeah.
Sure. And the church has always affirmed that older couples that are infertile, there's nothing wrong with that as long as the intention is there. There would be a problem, according to current teaching, with a younger couple that was fertile deciding not to have children at all because you promised in your vows to accept children to accept children as a gift.
Thank you. One more? Back in the back there.
I was just wondering if you guys could help out with this, being married. Jesus says that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord with all your mind, body, and soul. How does, for someone who is not married and looking into the road, maybe someday becoming married, how does that work out? Has it been difficult to both love your spouse with your heart and at the same time love God with all of it?
For one, I have to admit, I never really all that great about loving God with all my heart before I got married. So it's kind of hard to think about whether that wrecked it or not. Does that make sense? I'm serious about that. But I can tell a story about my wife, who after we had our first child and she was pregnant for her second, was so concerned that she thought, how am I going to be able to love this next child the way I love the first and still love the first as much as I do now? And this was a real crisis, which I'm kind of a dumb guy, so I kind of don't get these things at all. But anyway, and I didn't have an answer. I did not have an answer. And so we obsessed about this for a few weeks. And as it turns out, when you have more people around, you got more love around. And so I think that's the answer. I think the answer is that people who are alone don't love God more. In fact, I would take that with celibacy. I know I work in our department with a priest, and I would say that he's got far more people in his life than I do, and he's got far more people around that have a claim on him than I do. I just have to have little ones that have a claim on me and attach themselves. But I would assume that either in a non-married state or a married state, the answer is the same. That you got more people around, you got more love of God around.
I think to compare loving God with loving your family is like comparing light with color. They can't, in principle, be in contrast. Let me be more concrete. I remember when I had my first two kids, first a boy, then a girl. My son asked me, "Daddy, do you love me the most in the whole world?" And my daughter was right there. I said, "Yes, I do." And my daughter looked disappointed. And I said to her, "And I love you the most in the whole world, too." And they understood that. That might have been a logical or mathematical contradiction, but they understood that. So I think it's the same way with God and your spouse. I'm not married to God. I'm married to my wife. And I don't adore my wife, I adore God. There's no contradiction. One is the light, the other is the color.
I think in my paper, I raised that as a potential problem. And while I agree to a great extent with what David and Peter have said, I also see that there are limits to what we can do, so that I know my children have seen these limits. My son Stephen asked me at a very young age, "Do you love God more than me?" And it seemed to him that I did, because I repressed his natural tendency to talk and play during Mass. And this is when he confronted me with the question repeatedly, though it seemed as if I was putting God first. And I would try to talk to him about how I love God through him and all this. It didn't really satisfy him very much at all. But I think he's come to appreciate it. But he also knows, as I think do all my children and my husband as well, that there is there are sometimes different commitments. My celibate colleagues, who are priests and women religious, can do more than I can. They probably spend more hours in meditative prayer than I can as a working mother. They are able to do more for their students than I can. They are able to say yes to lots more things than I can. And when my little 5-year-old said to me today, "Mom, don't go. I want you home tonight," and I want to come here and talk to you about marriage and God, and that's a limitation. I can't be in both places at once. I don't know that means I'm loving one less, but it certainly divides one's time and energy. And hopefully they're different energy, applying work in different areas is leading ultimately to the same end, but it sure looks different when you're married, I think.
I remember Meister Eckhart talking about Mary and Martha, the scene in the Gospels, and I'm not sure whether it's about celibacy in married life or not. I'm not sure it is, but he doesn't take the traditional line that Mary's contemplative life is superior to Martha's active life. He takes the same line Thomas Aquinas takes when he was asked the question, is the contemplative life superior to the active life? And he said, the superior life is the mixed life, the sharing of contemplation by action. So Eckhart says, we must do the works of Martha in the spirit of Mary. It's a combination.
That might be a good place to end this evening. We all have multiple engagements, multiple conflicts, multiple ties on our time. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to our speakers.